Hello, I'm Perrin, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Business of Business. My guest today is Eric Gales, who's the Country Manager for Amazon Web Services Canada. With 30 years of technology industry experience, he sets the strategic direction for one of the core elements of the AWS commercial sector business. Eric has the responsibility of driving customer relations in all core AWS Canada operations, including business development, sales, partner alliances, manufacturing, solutions, architecture, support, and training. Now, before joining AWS in October 2015, Eric served as VP and General Manager of VMware Canada and as President of Microsoft Canada. Well, as you'll discover very shortly, he was born in the UK. Eric loved Canada so much that he became a citizen. He and his wife reside in Oakville with their 2 teenage children. And in Eric's spare time, he plays in a beer league hockey team, pretty Canadian, and has a private pilot's license flying out of Burlington Airport. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today on the Business of Business. Welcome.
Thanks, Perrin. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, when most of us think about Amazon, we think about those deliveries of Amazon boxes to our homes. Amazon Web Services is less well known to the general public, yet it's a core element of Amazon's business. Can you briefly describe AWS to us and explain why it's so important?
Yeah, for sure. So as Amazon was growing, as you can imagine, it was built to service customers over the internet. As it was growing and scaling, Amazon itself ran into challenges in scaling those IT services. It grew frustrated with often sort of being beholden to vendors. And so it started to build its own approach to how it would underpin its business using technology, using what are called web services. And so built a new strategy to use web services that underpin the Amazon business itself. And then just over a decade ago, that was so successful that just over a decade or so ago, somebody internally proposed that given that this had been so powerful to help the Amazon business itself scale, perhaps other customers might be interested in leveraging these capabilities. And so AWS was born of Amazon as a discrete business to take a lot of the lessons that had been learned in servicing the Amazon business and taking those capabilities and those web services, IT services delivered over the internet to other customers. And what they found was it was super successful. Customers were very interested in being able to consume these services over the internet rather than having to build and manage them themselves. And as they say, it is a bit of a cliche that the rest is history. The business has grown substantially because it really met a need for customers that had not been met before.
So that, while it wasn't core at the beginning, it grew to be central to the business strategy for Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that Amazon works, which is really a function of the way that Jeff Bezos approached the business from the start, is that there's a set of leadership principles that some of your viewers, listeners may be familiar with. There are 14 leadership principles. There's now actually 16, 2 recently added, but 14 leadership principles that sort of underwrite the way that the company's wired, the culture of the company. The first of those is something called customer obsession, which is working backwards from challenges of customers, both internally and externally. And so web services was a service that was built internally originally to solve for the internal requirements of business users and the consumers that they were servicing. But that business grew into an opportunity to service customers externally and became a core business in its own right. And so AWS is now, it's still the services that underpin Amazon, but then there are millions of customers now around the world that use AWS to run their own businesses, and the same principles apply. The AWS portfolio of services has grown primarily on the back of listening to customers, working back from their challenges, and then building new capabilities that service those customers. But when those services are built and federated through the AWS infrastructure, which is global, every customer gets to use them. And so it's been a very interesting phenomenon to see the organic growth of listening to customers, building services, and then see that adopted by many more customers.
I want to pursue that for a minute. At first glance, cloud services may seem something to smaller businesses that apply only to big business. Yet it's something that is Amazon feels is very important for small and medium-sized businesses as well. What is it that makes cloud computing so appealing for small and medium-sized businesses?
Yeah, that's really what one of the things that makes it so powerful. And if you can forgive me to sort of use an analogy, if we sort of go back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, there was a requirement for people to perhaps situate their mills next to a power source, which may have been a river. And so they would get their power from that river to service them, to serve the machines that they were using to help them get away from using exclusively manual labor. And then at some point, the steam engine was invented. And so when the steam engine was invented, then you could put those in different situations, those factories in different situations, but still you'd have to have the capital. But if you had the capital, you could invest the capital in having steam engines that would generate power that you could use in your factory. And then, of course, over time, electricity came along and electricity generating companies came along that meant that now, to some extent, you could say electricity had been democratized. You no longer had to have the capital to build a generation plant. You could just use that electricity. And so that is analogous here to web services. These are web services that we have built and that we operate and we run. They're available to anybody to consume and use. They're not exclusively at the disposal of companies that have a huge amount of capital to build and run their own infrastructure, which is one of the things that actually makes them appealing to large enterprises. But it means those same services that AWS uses to service Amazon, the business of Amazon and Netflix and Bank of Montreal and Sun Life and others, those services are exactly the same services that are available to any small business to use. And so they can have access to the scale, the flexibility, the power, and the range of services that are available. And so it's a profound change in this IT computing world, where it used to be very analogous to that situation where if you could afford the capital to build a plant, to generate electricity, you had an advantage. Now that situation, there's no requirement to build infrastructure, to have capital available to build these services, to service yourself. You can just use them on an on-demand way and pay for what you use. And so it's a profound different platform environment available to every size of scale of business. And so we have millions of customers, from the smallest startups to the largest enterprises, using their services. And then, interestingly enough, of course, because we have that range, that continuum, we get feedback from all of those services. So the specific needs of small businesses, we can ingest and we can render that in the services that we deliver to everyone else.
So it closes some of that gap in resources between small businesses and the giants.
Yeah, it's really, it closes the gap in capabilities. So, there are often, in the past, if you were a small business, I think we can all agree that our economy, our culture, the way we interact, it continues to be digitized. And so that has been the case for the last couple of decades. We can anticipate that that's going to continue. And so these computing platforms, they underpin how we trade, how we work, how we socialize, and that's going to continue. But in the past, if you're a small business with a fine amount of capital, you would have to make choices perhaps of what infrastructure you built, what you acquired, what you deployed, and then see if you got value from it, which would perhaps preclude you from doing something else because you had to limit your exposure there. In the world of web services, there's no requirement to displace that capital, to put that capital to work in those areas. You can just use these services in a way that's most applicable to you. And those services that are available to you include the most basic services of storage and compute and networking, all the way to the most advanced services like AI and machine learning that in the past perhaps would have only been the domain of the most wealthy enterprises, but now are available to anybody to consume and use.
Can you give us an example, for example, of how a small business might be able to use this and how it's practically been of benefit to people on Main Street?
Yeah, I'll give you a few different examples just to sort of exhibit a few different points. Some of these it's been interesting. They've been sort of catalyzed. They've been illuminated through this COVID crisis. So I give you an example of a customer that's out west in Calgary called Kadoodle.tv, and so they build content for children for TV networks. They're a small to mid-sized company. During the COVID, they run on AWS. Their services run on AWS, and they already using our services. They've been able to make their content available globally without having to build any infrastructure globally, because our infrastructure is global. And so they can make their content available in the different countries that they operate in. When the COVID crisis hit, the demand for child-safe content, of course, drew dramatically because children were spending more time at home. And so they were able to scale their business exponentially without having to expend any capital on any assets. They could just use the fabric of AWS to service those customers around the world and provide the content. Another sort of more traditional example would be we've got a customer in Montreal called Cookit that does boxed food. Again, they were doing that way before the COVID crisis, so meal kits. Of course, when the COVID crisis hit, the demand for their boxed food meals went through the roof. They were able to use our services to scale the way that they could take orders and process their supply chain in order to bring their services to bear to service their customers. And then a more traditional example, a company called Bonlook that does eyewear. So they have a range of retail stores across the country. Of course, they had to transition to not dealing with customers in person. They actually used AI and machine learning tools to look at their database of customers to then target their customers with offers and promotions that were relevant to them. And so that is a set of capabilities typically not available to SMBs in the past, but now through web services, they're available for them to consume and use and apply to the data that they have to service their customers better.
Can we talk security for a minute? Obviously, security is an area of concern for businesses that have been thinking about adopting cloud solutions. And we've been hearing that the number of cyber attacks on businesses has grown dramatically since the beginning of the pandemic. You're in a very good position to track what's been happening. What are you seeing, first of all, in terms of the frequency and severity of these attacks? Is it correct that they're significantly on the rise at this point?
I think if you were to sort of correlate it, you'd really see that it's a function more of the rate of adoption of these digital services. And so the number of services, the number of interactions that we have, the dependency on using IT services, of course, that's gone up and up. And so the surface area that bad forces can sort of target has gone up. And so that's not surprising. But it does mean that as we continue to focus on delivering these IT capabilities and customers using these capabilities, security is a very important focus. In fact, at AWS, it's job one. You can imagine we have millions of customers using our services, but the priority for us is the security of those services. And our capabilities are built obviously to service every type and size of customer, from the most highly regulated to the military, to financial services. And so the core services themselves, we have a huge focus on the security of our platform. But just like any other security paradigm, there's also a dependency on the customers understanding how to use these services and to secure them too, because you could have all of the security environment that you like on your home, but if you still fail to lock the door when you leave, or you still fail to turn that alarm on, of course, you still have some exposure. And so we have what we call a shared security model, where we are responsible for the security of the cloud, and you are responsible for the security in the cloud. But there are lots of capabilities which are built into the platform itself to help you to secure your environment, so that if there is nefarious behavior or abnormal behavior, then that can be detected and that can be surfaced to you again in ways that typically SMBs do not have on-prem. And so in a traditional IT world, you typically don't have those capabilities because they cost money to deploy, they cost money to manage, they cost money to configure, whereas those services in many cases are native to the AWS platform. And so you can just take advantage of them and they will help you to secure your environment. And this security paradigm is, as you sort of indicated, is an ongoing process. We've certainly seen an increase in the incidence of ransomware attacks, for example, but the cloud can bring a great set of capabilities to help customers protect themselves from ransomware attacks, or to deal with a ransomware attack in a way that it's much more difficult to do when you're trying to do that on premises in a more traditional way. And so I think we can anticipate that those ransomware attacks, that they will continue. And so helping customers to think through securing themselves from that exposure, and also having mitigations in place in the event that they do encounter a ransomware attack, for example, we're certainly seeing the incidence of that go up.
So, well, it's not surprising that people's initial response, if they hear that it's dangerous out there, is, well, if this information leaves my hands, I've lost control of it, it's at risk. You could draw an analogy to a bank. Your inclination might be to keep all your cash at home, but it's an awful lot more secure when you put it into the bank and when there are higher levels of security. You're still responsible for ensuring that your practices with your bank account are secure and that you maintain your passwords and protect yourself. But when it comes to the security of the system, you're dealing with resources that are far greater than any of us could have on our own.
Yeah, I think, that, Perrin, that's a great analogy. And if you think about it, if you were for perhaps decided to sort of take care of entirely of your own money and you were going to look after it at home, and so you would have to put it in a secure box perhaps, but then if you had it in a secure box, who's watching it when you leave the house? When you leave the house, now it's at the mercy of whatever protections you have in your house. In the bank, of course, the bank has all of those protections in place all of the time, and so you're not worried about that component. And so the surface area that you're concerned about is protecting your password, your login, your personal details. Similarly, in that cloud analogy, we are taking care of the physical infrastructure, all of the controls in place to manage the environment. The level of capabilities within the platform itself typically exceed what a customer would have on premise, including things like encryption, so a native encryption to the platform. So even if you were to lose your data, you have the keys to the encryption. And so that analogy that says the actual surface area that you have to worry about from a security perspective, it gets a lot smaller when you take advantage of web services and cloud capabilities, because a big component of that security platform is taken care of by AWS in this case.
So you provide a platform that's secure. Do you also work with the customers in terms of the other component you were talking about, and that's their own behavior? If you were going to use this platform, here's good hygiene, if you like, in terms of security.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at the sort of the history of computing, and I've been in the industry for a while. When I started in this industry, I guess we'd say it was the dawn of the PC era. When I started working, I worked on mid-range computers. Mid-range had come along and had wrapped mainframes. And then really the dawn of the PC. And the PC era was the era that really proliferated devices into the hands of users and created a new level of productivity. But in each phase of computing, it brought both incredible new value, but also new challenges, because before the PC, you didn't have machines that were distributed or roaming when mobile computers came along, which had data on them. And so it was a new security paradigm that people had to contemplate and think about how you would secure all those different devices and how you protect yourself from viruses and things like that. And so in each phase of this sort of computing paradigm, the nature of what you need to do to secure yourself has changed, but is cumulative. So I think we can all agree that protecting passwords and protecting the division of labor in terms of how you manage these systems has got more and more important as the dependency has gone up. And so one has to know how to use these tools. And so we do spend a lot of energy on education and training, and also tooling that helps to augment. So we can automate a lot of these processes, so you can indicate behavior that's not normal, for example. There are other third-party tools that can be introduced into an environment to help you, as well as we have a big partner network, and we always encourage customers to either engage AWS directly or partners to help them leverage these capabilities, because it's one thing having those capabilities, it's another one knowing how to use them. But that is a very important component, and so we do spend a lot of time and energy helping our customers to understand how to use these tools and how to secure themselves, and federating that knowledge, and also learning from our customer engagements and feeding that back into the tools and processes and training that we make available to keep this sort of positive virtuous cycle of helping customers to stay secure as possible and maximize the return on investment from these services.
What would be some of the other ways in which SMEs could derive business and organizational value from cloud and big data technologies, in addition to the issue of security?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that in many cases our sort of SMEs have an advantage is in many large enterprises. If we go back to sort of my original analogy of in the past, if you had capital that you could invest in infrastructure and resources you could invest in deploying and managing services, you could get an advantage because you could do something that perhaps smaller companies could not do. Interestingly enough, in this sort of new paradigm of if we were to start a business tomorrow, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't go and deploy. We'd just start using these services and we would grow on the back of these services. Many SMEs are in a situation where they don't have all of this legacy environment, this legacy infrastructure. They have a different opportunity available. If they do, then we always encourage to say you need to find a way to jettison that over time, because whereas it used to be something that was perhaps an advantage, or it was something that at least you had parity, now the more contemporary way of building and using IT is to use cloud services. And so moving to that paradigm is important. And so there is a transformational component, a new mindset in terms of how you think about, if you agree that using technology is important to your business, if you do see the potential to continue to digitize, to engage your customers or consumers, your employees, then that needs to be transformed from the traditional ways of doing things. And that is something that, again, I spend a lot of time talking to customers about how to get to that point. What do you need to do differently? And we have lots of programs and services and experience to help people think through that transformation. But the other dimension of that is that the range of capabilities that are now available, what I often find is, of course, that people's frame of reference is a function of the more traditional ways of doing things. And so every new service, every new capability was just an additional cost to be thought about, a business case to be made, a decision to be invested in, and then see if you get value. Whereas the beauty of the cloud is that you don't have that. These services are all available for use at any time. You can try them and use them, and if you get value, you can keep using them, but if you don't, you can just turn it off. You didn't commit a bunch of expenditure. And so that mindset shift to say you now have this much broader set of capabilities available to you, and so the surface area that you can target within your organization to leverage these capabilities is enormous. And so you can really start to think differently about how you apply these technologies to help your business improve its execution, lower its cost, improve its reach, expand globally in ways that you really couldn't do before. And so that's something I think I encourage every SME to go and explore and take a look and start working to see how these web services could help their organizations transform.
So if you were looking at somebody starting a new business, in the past, you would think, well, you're at a real disadvantage because there are other established businesses that are there. They have all of the infrastructure in place. They have their business model and so on. What you're talking about suggests that in some instances for entrepreneurs, the people coming in fresh who can design their business models around these new technologies and services may have a competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think, we've seen during this COVID era, the rate of startups launching has gone up. I think, partly obviously in some cases they had some more time on their hands. In other cases, they were displaced from a company that was perhaps struggling. The outlets for capital to be sort of rendered to help businesses start has been going up. And so we have seen a huge increase. In general, those startups, of course, they start using web services because it's so obvious now that being able to engage and use those services and just pay for what you use is a profoundly different approach to even what we saw during the sort of the dot-com boom era, where a huge amount of money was expended on building physical infrastructure that later on didn't go anywhere. In the case of web services, it's possible to start businesses and just pay for what you use. And so you can explore and evolve and grow in ways that you really couldn't before. And so I'd say the answer to that question is yes. In many cases, there are some advantages in starting a business now that doesn't have any of that legacy that it's carrying forward. And it creates incredible new opportunities to scale and grow both locally and globally in ways that you really couldn't before.
Eric, analysts who've been looking at small businesses in Canada have said that the rate of adoption of new technologies, particularly computer technologies, by small business lags our counterparts in other countries. From where you sit, is that the case, or are Canadians catching up?
Well, as you sort of indicated at the beginning, I'm from the UK. I am a very proud Canadian now, but I've lived here for 16 years. But I would say is that my own sort of personal sort of observation, and obviously having proximity to the US market in particular, I would say in general we have seen a slower rate of adoption of technology generally here in Canada. However, what we've seen in this COVID crisis, it's been a very interesting sort of catalytic opportunity for lots of businesses to look at their businesses and think about how they've been able to adapt during this crisis, because everyone had to work from home. Perhaps you couldn't meet your customers in the way that you would have liked to in the past. And I'm sure there's no business leader that one day went into their business before the crisis and said, hey, why don't we try something? Nobody come to the office and we won't meet any customers, and let's see if we can manage. But it forced every business to sort of test the edges. And it's been interesting because I think it's enabled lots of businesses to be compelled to look at approaching things in different ways, find a way to get my people to work from home, interact with my customers in a new way. There's a tremendous catch-up opportunity here because I think it's illuminated the art of the possible for many businesses. And so I do see a big opportunity for Canadian businesses, and we have seen a big uptick in the interest in exploring these services. And the other thing that we've been trying to do, at least as a company in Canada, is to point to examples, real Canadian examples, like Cadoodle, for example, who are businesses born in Canada, growing on the back of this platform in ways that are very exciting and made possible by the platform that they're using. And so that's something that we take responsibility, because I really do see a different behavior from those business leaders that understand the potential of these new capabilities and those that don't. And so part of the mission of my team and myself is to raise that profile, to enable SMEs to explore and take advantage of them. But I encourage everybody to look at them because they're applicable. These services are applicable to every size and scale of business, and they're used by every size and scale of business globally.
Eric, a friend who has just completed a book on the best habits of successful business leaders, has the thesis that the most important criterion, most important quality is resilience and adaptability. Is that what you're finding as a result of this, that COVID has forced businesses and business leadership to be much more resilient, much more adaptable than ever before, and that they'll carry those habits forward as we go to more normal times?
Yeah, there's a quote that I often talk to senior executives, which I use, and Jeff Bezos has used it, although I don't think he originated it, which is the only sustainable competitive advantage is innovation. And if I think back to my own sort of history of working in the IT sector and the many businesses I've worked with, I could, as I'm sure you could, rattle off many names of companies who were at the top of their game, and then they weren't, and in many cases, and then they were gone. And if you sort of trace, well, why? They were so strong. You can always trace it to a lack of innovation on the cost structure, the supply chain, the interaction with customers, the productivity. Some component will be they didn't innovate, they didn't take advantage of the opportunity. And so that is the essence, I think, of successful companies, is they know how to innovate. They know that, and regardless of how well you're doing today, what about tomorrow? But it's very hard to generate that culture. When things are going well, people tend to sort of take a little step back, whereas actually you have to be wired, I think, to another phrase that often, only the paranoid survive. I'm a believer in that, although it's a bit more of a negative sentiment. But that idea that, if you really want to continue to stay at the top, to move forward, to grow, you have to be innovating. Sometimes it takes a catalytic event to force that, to sort of expose to you the weaknesses that you have in your business or the potential opportunity you have. And this crisis has been one of those. And so I think the answer is yes, this has been a catalytic event for people to step back. In many cases, just be exposed to new capabilities. In the first few months of the crisis, globally, with a service called AWS Connect, I think we stood up something like 5,000 call centers within a few months, because businesses needed to do something, but that may have been their first exposure to the power of cloud services, being able to stand up a call center in a matter of days, which is the first opportunity for them to have a realization that, wow, anything I've done in the past with IT has taken months or years. How did that happen? It's a function of these capabilities, on demand, pay as you go, super elastic. And so, I'm definitely excited about the potential here to help customers accelerate their rate of adoption and use these services to accelerate their businesses and innovate.
Eric, even before COVID, we were seeing digitalization taking place, the digitalization of Canadian society and Canadian business. But it's often said that one of the impacts of COVID is it caused us to jump several years in terms of the adoption of digital technologies. Is that your assessment? And as we come out of COVID, do you think those habits that we picked up of looking toward web services and looking toward digitalization will accelerate, or that will slide backward?
I think we certainly see it accelerating. I think because it has forced this exposure, even in our own business, as we sort of were talking about, we have trainers on staff who spend time with customers, training customers on how to use these services. And when COVID came along, of course, we wanted to continue to deliver training, but in the past, those trainers would travel. They'd be traveling around the country, visiting customer sites and doing their training on-prem. And we had to adapt. And so we equipped all of those trainers with green screens and equipment at home so they could do high quality presentations from home in a way that we hadn't before. And what's been interesting is we found that our trainers enjoy that more because they're traveling less, they're more productive. The feedback from our customers is just as positive as it was before. And so we have this new opportunity as a result of that, this forcing function, to continue that. And we anticipate continuing that modality, whereas we had never tested it before. We'd always assumed that it needed to be on premise. And so they're now equipped to work in a new way. They're happier employees. They're being just as productive, and our customers are enjoying their training. There are many cases like that in many of our customers where they were forced to service their customers digitally, and that has translated into happier customers, better capabilities. It may have been hard for a short period of time whilst, of course, those customers adapted to that new modality, but it's actually something that will endure and has been a catalyst for them to explore, well, what else can we do? When they move to that kind of interaction with their customers or their employees or their consumers, it's really sort of opened up the opportunity to think differently moving forward. And so we anticipate that this will be something that will continue to accelerate into 22 and beyond.
Final question. As you look down into the future, as you look ahead, are web services essentially mature at this point? Or do you see new horizons in terms of the development of new services that will be made available in the future that perhaps we haven't thought of as yet?
Yeah, the latter. The rate at which services have been delivered and the capabilities of each of those services has actually been going up. Even in the 6 years I've been at AWS, that rate has been increasing because we are a big aggregator of feedback. And so we have big aggregator of feedback from customers that we can ingest and then put into a development model which is designed to meet the needs of those customers. And so as we deploy new services and customers start to use them, it creates an opportunity for customers to give us feedback on those particular services or indicate, boy, it would be great if you could help me with this service. And so the range of services has been going up. And of course, many of those services, they interact with each other. If you move to a digital call center, for example, then as you interact with your consumers that may be calling in, your customers that are calling into that call center, a lot of that content can be digitized. Then you can look at sentiment analysis. You can start to look at patterns of behavior using machine learning. And so there's kind of a continuum of opportunity. And the web services platform is essentially a sort of a portfolio of building blocks that can be assembled to meet specific needs, but there are often patterns in there. And so this portfolio, we certainly anticipate continuing to grow based on these interactions with these customers as we learn about how more we can help them. And as we focus on the key challenges in particular verticals, we work in every size and scale of vertical. And so these services are deployed to many different types of scenario. often with common sets of capabilities like machine learning, which is applicable to pretty much any business now that has data. And so we're excited about the opportunity to continue to iterate on the services themselves that are already deployed, but also to build and bring to market new services that can help our customers.
Eric, thank you. That excitement that you're talking about is evident. You're excited by what you've achieved so far, but it's obvious that you're simply standing at the edge of something that is even going to be more exciting in the future. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing what Amazon Web Services does and how it can lead to more successful businesses in Canada.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.